Max stood up, his voice shaking, yet clear. "You didn't just steal money. You killed someone." The courtroom froze. His mother's face went pale as the room buzzed with disbelief. Max had just exposed a secret too dark to imagine. But what happened next would shatter everything. What came after that would leave everyone stunned. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension, every eye fixed on the man behind the bench, Judge Harold Peterson. His sharp, calculating gaze flicked over the legal documents before him, the faint sound of paper rustling barely breaking the heavy silence. Today's case was nothing extraordinary on the surface. Richard Green, a corporate executive, was accused of embezzling funds from a prominent charity. Yet there was a thick undercurrent of something unspoken, an invisible weight that hung in the air, felt by everyone in the room, even if no one could name it. Max Miller sat in the front row, his small frame lost in a sea of suited professionals and polished shoes. His messy brown hair was unkempt, and his eyes, wide and innocent, seemed to hold an understanding that didn't quite belong to someone his age. At just 10 years old, Max was here by circumstance rather than choice. His mother, a lawyer involved in the case, had brought him along for the day, and while she was absorbed in the arguments of the trial, Max's mind wandered elsewhere. He had the habit of noticing things others missed, like how Richard Green couldn't meet anyone's eyes, how his hands trembled ever so slightly when he reached to adjust his tie. Max's instincts had always been sharper than people gave him credit for, and the man at the defendant's stand felt wrong, deeply wrong. It wasn't just that he seemed uncomfortable. It was as if something darker lurked beneath his polished exterior. As the trial progressed, Max shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze constantly drifting back to Green. The courtroom around him buzzed with the usual mix of legal jargon, clacking keyboards, and the rustle of paper. A few journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks, the dull hum of conversation occasionally filling the air. Lawyers in sharply tailored suits leaned in to discuss tactics, their voices low and authoritative. But Max felt none of that calm. Instead, an invisible pressure weighed down on him, like the prelude to something catastrophic. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something everyone in this room, including his mother, was missing. The case on the surface, Green's embezzlement charges, seemed straightforward enough. But earlier that day, as his mother worked late in her office preparing for the trial, Max had overheard a conversation that made his stomach twist. The words had been muffled by the thick walls of the office, but Max had heard enough. His mother, always careful with her words, had been speaking to a colleague in hushed tones about Green's case. What he hadn't expected to hear was that Green was more than just a corporate thief. There was something darker, something much more dangerous beneath the surface, something involving illegal transactions that reached far beyond embezzlement. Max couldn't understand all of it. He didn't know the specifics, but he knew enough to realize that Green's entire defense was built on a lie that he would do anything to keep hidden. The defense team's hurried whispers, the way they tried to distract from certain details in their argument, Max had noticed it all. It wasn't just the money they were trying to hide. There was something far more sinister at play. The courtroom felt suffocating as the trial wore on. Max had always been an observant child, but today, everything seemed magnified. Every glance exchanged, every shift in posture, every stilted word felt loaded with meaning. As the trial continued, Green's strange behavior grew more pronounced. He shifted in his seat, avoided direct eye contact, and wiped his brow more than usual. He seemed to shrink under the weight of the accusations, as though his very presence was being scrutinized. Max's fingers twitched nervously, unsure of what he should do with this new, unsettling knowledge. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to know any of this. His world should have been filled with things like school and video games, not corporate secrets or illegal dealings. But somehow, Max had found himself entangled in something much larger than he could have imagined. The secret Green was hiding was far bigger than anyone realized. Max looked down at his lap, biting his lip. His mind raced. Was he just imagining things? Was it possible that a 10-year-old could even grasp the magnitude of what he had overheard? He wanted to look to his mother for answers, but she was absorbed in the legal arguments, her focus completely fixed on the case. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. No one else had heard the conversation. No one else seemed to notice that Green was hiding something, and if no one else was going to speak up, Max was the only one who could. The weight of it all began to settle in. His small shoulders felt heavy with the secret. He had overheard too much, seen too much. What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? He wasn't sure, but he knew he had to do something. His stomach churned as he tried to focus on the trial again. But every word Green spoke felt like a lie. Max couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was off, and it wasn't just the charges on the paper. There was something buried deep under the surface, something only Max seemed to sense. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing feeling that wouldn't let go. There was a story here, a story no one else could see. And Max wasn't sure if he was ready to hear the rest of it, but he couldn't look away. Not now. The room seemed to grow colder as the trial went on, as if the walls themselves were pressing in, suffocating him with the knowledge he wasn't supposed to have. Max's gaze locked on Green once more. The man's composure was slipping, his confidence eroding as he tried to maintain his facade. But the cracks were showing. Max could see it. And somehow he knew that whatever was about to happen would change everything. The tension in the room had reached its peak. Max felt it, an unbearable anticipation that made his heart race. He glanced over at his mother, who was busy with the paperwork, unaware of what he had overheard. She had no idea what her son had learned, no idea that he was the only one who seemed to understand the truth. As Max sat there, waiting for the inevitable moment, he realized that no one could protect them from what was coming next. And then, the silence grew louder, as if the entire world had paused, waiting for Max to decide whether or not to speak. The trial rumbled on, the rhythm of legal arguments flowing like a dull background hum. Lawyers for both sides had carefully honed their presentations, and the proceedings seemed almost mechanical, as if everyone was stuck in an endless loop of rehearsed motions. Max, however, felt none of the calm that seemed to settle over the room. His mind was racing, caught between the cold, calculated language of the courtroom and the growing sense of dread gnawing at his insides. He sat there, alone in the front row, feeling the weight of the adult world closing in around him. He wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't supposed to understand all the intricacies of the legal battle unfolding before him, yet he couldn't help but listen. There were moments when he thought he could see beyond the surface, when the words the lawyers spoke seemed to hold deeper meanings, twisted meanings, ones that made his stomach churn. Max's eyes stayed glued to the defendant's seat, where Richard Green sat, his face locked in an expression of practiced calm. Green's sharp, tailored suit looked almost out of place in the tension-filled room. He had perfected the art of appearing unfazed, the kind of man who could smile even when the world seemed to be crashing down around him. He was good at hiding his true self. Too good, Max thought. But even a master of deceit couldn't hide everything. Green's hands were shaking slightly as he adjusted the collar of his shirt, a nervous tic that spoke louder than words. His face, usually composed and confident, was slick with sweat, the beads of moisture glistening under the harsh courtroom lights. His eyes darted around the room, avoiding direct contact with anyone. Max saw it, the crack in the facade. He wasn't just nervous, he was panicking. And that panic wasn't the result of the embezzlement charges alone. There was something much darker lurking beneath the surface. Max's mind flashed back to the conversation he had overheard earlier in the day. The words had been whispered in his mother's office, but he had heard enough. Green wasn't just guilty of stealing from a charity. The embezzlement was only the beginning of a much darker story. There had been talk of illegal transactions, of hidden deals that tied him to something far more sinister. Max didn't know all the details, but the gravity of what he had overheard had made his pulse race, his chest tight with the sense that something terrible was about to come to light. It was then, as Green took the stand, that Max knew. The room had quieted, everyone focusing on the defendant as he answered questions with practiced ease. He was telling his version of the story, the version everyone was supposed to believe. But Max could see the cracks in the performance. He could feel it, the way Green's voice wavered slightly, the way his eyes shone with something far darker than fear. Max could hear the questions coming from the lawyers, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of the trial. The defense, smooth and calculated, was doing everything they could to protect Green. They painted him as a man under pressure, someone who had made mistakes but wasn't the monster the prosecution claimed he was. Yet Max knew what the others couldn't see. Green was more than a man caught in a web of financial wrongdoing. He was hiding something else, something that would tear this case apart. Max sat up straighter, his hands gripping the edge of his seat as his mind sharpened. His instincts told him that this was the moment everything would come crashing down. He couldn't sit here anymore, not with the knowledge gnawing at him, not with the truth that seemed so close, so within reach. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, Max stood up. His tiny figure barely made a ripple in the sea of adults, but in that moment, it felt like he was a giant. The movement wasn't dramatic, yet it was enough to draw the attention of the room. Conversation stopped. People turned, their eyes narrowing as they took in the sight of the young boy standing, alone and unafraid, in the front row. Max's heart hammered in his chest, but he didn't hesitate. He had no plan, no script to follow. All he knew was that he had to speak. His voice, although small, rang out clear and strong, filling the courtroom with an intensity that stunned everyone into silence. "I know what happened," Max said, his voice steady, the words coming out with a weight that made the air seem thicker. He didn't look around at the shocked faces staring at him. Instead, his eyes were fixed solely on Green, who had gone still, his composure faltering for the first time. "You didn't just steal money," Max continued, his words hanging heavy in the air. "You killed someone." A deathly silence descended upon the courtroom. No one moved, no one spoke. Max's words echoed in the hushed room, reverberating off the cold, sterile walls. His declaration was like a shockwave, a sudden explosion of truth that shattered the fragile calm of the trial. All eyes turned toward him. Some were filled with disbelief, others with anger. Max's mother, sitting just a few rows behind, leapt to her feet, her face pale as she stared at her son, her eyes wide with shock. She knew he had overheard something, but she had never imagined this. Never in her wildest dreams had she expected her son to make such an accusation. And yet, here he was, standing in front of the entire courtroom, a single child against a room full of powerful, experienced adults. The room buzzed with murmurs, voices rising in confusion and outrage. The defense attorney shot out of his chair, his face flushed with panic, trying to regain control. The prosecutor, momentarily stunned, quickly found his voice, demanding that Max be silenced, that the outburst be disregarded. But it was too late. The seed had been planted. Max stood there, his heart racing, his eyes never leaving Green. The man on the stand was no longer the confident corporate executive everyone had believed him to be. He was a man cornered, exposed, his guilt written in every tremor of his hands, in the flicker of fear in his eyes. Max had struck the first blow, and now it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. But as the chaos erupted around him, Max remained still, his voice unwavering, as if he knew the truth would find its way out, no matter how hard they tried to silence it. Green's face contorted, his carefully crafted facade cracking in an instant. What was once a calm, almost charming expression now twisted into something darker, something unnervingly inhuman. For a brief moment, his eyes darted wildly, looking for a way out, a way to dismiss the words that had just shattered everything he'd worked to protect. But Max's voice lingered in the room, an echo that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the courtroom. He tried to laugh it off, but it wasn't the chuckle of a man in control. It was forced, hollow, as if he were desperately trying to convince himself that the accusation could be ignored. His throat tightened as he glanced nervously around the room, searching for someone to back him up, to dismiss the boy's claim as a wild fantasy. But it was too late. The seed had been planted, and there was no going back. The room erupted into chaos. People stood up, shouting in disbelief, some trying to get the judge's attention, others murmuring frantically among themselves. Lawyers scrambled to regain control, their voices rising in panic. The murmurs of disbelief were drowned out by the shuffling of feet and the clattering of papers. No one could understand what had just happened, what Max had said, or what it meant for the case. But Max stood still, unwavering, his tiny frame a stark contrast to the disarray surrounding him. His eyes never left Green. Max's mother, who had been sitting a few rows back, was now on her feet, her face pale, her hands shaking. She could feel the weight of her son's words pressing down on her like 1,000 tons. She rushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest, to pull him back, to shield him from the fallout of what he had just done. But it was futile. It was too late to protect him. The truth had already been set into motion. Max remained rooted in place, his gaze locked on Green, his voice calm despite the storm that had erupted around him. It was as if he could feel the truth surging through him, the revelation that had torn the veil off a much darker story than anyone had anticipated. The courtroom was a whirlwind of confusion, but Max stood at the eye of the storm, an unflinching witness to something no one else had yet seen. The defense team scrambled to dismiss Max's words, to spin them as a mistake or a misinterpretation. But their panic was evident. They knew as well as anyone that what Max had said could not be undone. The damage had been done. The prosecutors, who had been struggling to find a foothold in the case, now found their footing. Emboldened by Max's words, they began digging into the evidence with newfound urgency. Within minutes, the courtroom that had been filled with chaos began to settle, the murmur of voices quieting as the prosecution uncovered something far darker than anyone had imagined. The digital records that Green had so carefully destroyed, the evidence he had tried to erase, began to surface. A hidden compartment in Green's briefcase was discovered, and with it, files that linked him directly to a murder, a crime far worse than embezzlement. The room fell into stunned silence. The tension that had been building in the air seemed to thicken, as if the very atmosphere had changed. Time seemed to slow, as if the universe itself had paused to absorb the weight of what had just been uncovered. The once confident defense team now sat in stunned silence, their faces pale, their arguments evaporating like smoke in the air. Max's revelation had done what no one else could. It had torn through the layers of deceit and manipulation, exposing a crime far greater than anyone had anticipated. The murder was real. The evidence was irrefutable. And Richard Green was at the center of it all. For a moment it felt as though the world had come to a standstill. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence was deafening, and it seemed as if the courtroom itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable fallout to follow. Max, still standing at the center of it all, felt a strange calm settle over him. It wasn't a sense of victory or relief. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the truth had been revealed, no matter how ugly or painful it might be. Max's mother, her hands still trembling, reached out to him, her face filled with a mixture of awe and fear. She had never imagined her son could be the one to expose the truth. She had never imagined that he would be the one to unravel the web of lies that had been spun around them all. But here they were, at the center of a revelation that would change everything. As the courtroom slowly came back to life, the defense's attempts to regain control seemed increasingly futile. The damage was done. The truth had come crashing down with the force of a wrecking ball, and nothing would be the same again. The prosecutors, now emboldened, turned their focus on Green, their questions growing sharper, more insistent. There was no more room for lies, no more space for deceit. The truth had finally emerged from the shadows, and it was far more horrifying than anyone had expected. Green, once so confident, now looked like a man caught in a trap of his own making. His hands trembled visibly, his breath shallow and rapid. His eyes darted around the room, but no one seemed to be on his side anymore. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, and for the first time, he looked truly afraid. Max, still standing, watched it all unfold with a quiet resolve. His eyes never wavered from Green, his mind focused solely on the truth that had been exposed. This was the moment he had unknowingly set into motion, and as the room around him began to buzz with a new, more urgent energy, Max knew that there was no going back. The truth had been set free, and nothing would be the same again. The courtroom was still reeling from the shocking revelation Max had made. The air was thick with tension, every person present aware that something monumental had just happened. Green, once confident and untouchable, now sat in stunned silence, his face drained of color. The weight of his guilt hung heavy in the room, undeniable and crushing. His defense, which had seemed so carefully constructed, crumbled in an instant. No more words could save him now. The truth was out, and there was nowhere left to hide. The courtroom fell silent as the judge, unable to ignore the overwhelming evidence, ordered Green's arrest on the spot. The officers approached, their footsteps heavy as they closed in on the man who had once been a symbol of power and wealth. Green barely flinched as the handcuffs clicked into place. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, now wide with something far darker. Sheer fear. As the officers led him away, Green's gaze shifted across the room. His eyes locked with Max's, and in that moment, something changed. There was no anger, no defiance, just fear. Fear of the truth Max had exposed, fear of the consequences that would follow. In those brief seconds, Max saw the man who had been a predator, a man who had believed he was untouchable, now reduced to a broken figure who realized his power had slipped away, never to return. The silence that had settled over the courtroom was broken by a sudden eruption of applause. It was as if the collective breath of the room had been held too long, and now, at last, everyone could exhale. The crowd, full of jurors, spectators, and even the journalists who had been observing, erupted into applause, loud, triumphant, and filled with a sense of vindication. The room was alive with emotion, but at its center stood Max, his small body barely visible among the crowd of adults, but his presence undeniable. Max's mother, who had been watching from the sidelines, stood frozen for a moment, her emotions a tangled mess of pride, disbelief, and fear. Her son had just done the unimaginable, exposed the truth in the most public way possible. She rushed to him, her heart pounding as she pulled him close. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight, as if trying to shield him from the weight of what they had just uncovered. She felt both proud of him for his bravery and sharpness, and terrified, because she knew that exposing such a dark truth would bring consequences they couldn't yet comprehend. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered into his hair, her voice trembling. But as she held him, Her mind couldn't escape the gravity of what had just transpired. Max hadn't just revealed a corporate crime. He had uncovered a murder, a series of events that had remained hidden for far too long. And in doing so, he had opened up a much larger story, one that would shake their lives in ways she couldn't yet understand. The applause continued for a moment, but Max barely noticed. He felt the weight of what had just happened settle on him. The noise, the excitement, it all felt distant. It was as if the world around him had slowed, the energy of the room vibrating in his chest. He could hear his mother's voice, but it seemed far away, muffled by the strange numbness that had overtaken him. Max had always been quiet, observant, but now, standing at the center of everything, he could feel the gravity of his actions. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't set out to bring down someone like Green. He had just known, somehow, that something wasn't right, and when the truth came to him, he hadn't hesitated. He had spoken, and now, everything had changed. The courtroom began to empty, the crowd slowly dissipating as the final moments of the trial passed. People moved in and out of the room, but for Max, time seemed to stand still. His thoughts were a whirlwind. He was still a child, just 10 years old, but today he had done something that many adults never would. He had found the courage to speak the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. Max walked out of the courtroom with his mother, his small frame carrying an unimaginable burden. The weight of what had just been uncovered settled on his shoulders, but he didn't show it. He kept his head high, his steps firm, though the world around him seemed to blur with the overwhelming sense of finality. His mother walked beside him, her hand firmly clutching his, guiding him through the aftermath. But even at just 10, Max knew that what had happened today was only the beginning. A beginning of something much larger than a single trial, larger than any one person's journey. He had exposed a lie, torn through layers of deception, and in doing so, he had given voice to those who had been silenced for so long. This was not the end of the story. It was only the first chapter. As they walked out of the courthouse, Max's mother glanced down at him, her expression full of both admiration and concern. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult. The story Max had revealed wasn't finished yet, and neither were the consequences. But she also knew that her son had just become part of something bigger than any of them could have imagined. Max had found his voice, and it had changed everything. Max, for his part, didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel it, the quiet certainty that the truth was now in motion, and no one could stop it. The courage to speak up, to fight for what was right, had already been forged. And he knew, as they walked out into the world beyond the courthouse doors, that this was just the beginning of a much larger story. A story of courage, of truth, and of the power of a single voice.